introducing who we are, why don't we start with our protagonist?
Okay, I'm just gonna talk loud. I'm Vicky. I was the one that was like, oh my gosh, why don't we run a panel about the stuff that we talk about all the time? And so I'm really excited because these two actually know what they're talking about, and I'm here to look intimidating and stare at you really hard. And I do need to.
So the game.
There is exactly one thing I need to do, and it is extremely important. I need to get a stupid selfie with all of you. So.
I'm sorry, Mom.
Look your fanciest.
Oh my God, guys! Look at all these crazy people I'm with. Whoa!
Archie.
You guys are great.
Thanks, guys.
Now we're going to have Kanji.
Oh, okay. I'm Al. I'm the pretty one. We discussed the idea for this panel together like months and months before KatsuCon. Thought it was really a thing that we wanted to do because it's stuff that we have a lot of interest in. Hey, you guys can read it? We're both from New York City. We do video gaming in our spare time. We also like to cosplay. I don't know why you would have gotten the idea that we would. And you will definitely know who my favorite Persona character is by the end of this panel.
Is it Kanji?
It's a surprise.
No, it's not.
Alright, my name is Lindsay. I'm also known as gryfeathr Photography. I do way too many things at the same time at conventions. I also have a bachelor's in East Asian Studies from Pennsylvania, and I'm basically here to talk to you about the mythology part of the panel. They might have just pulled me out of the hallway. I don't know them at all. I've been friends with them for years. I've never played this game clearly, and we should be having a good time, and I'm definitely out of place here, but bear with us.
Also, two more important things. This is not a spoiler-free panel. We tried to make that very clear. We are going to spoil everything for you if you haven't finished the game. So if you want to avoid that,
this is true ending spoiler
time stuff. Also, there isn't any stakes. Sorry, we didn't play stakes.
All right.
Now we're gonna one last thing, really quick. This is not a Persona 4 Golden panel. There's some stuff that they added in there that we actually are not that familiar with because we don't own Vitas. So
we tried to do our research best as we can, but if we miss something, that's because we haven't played Golden yet. That's why.
Yeah.
And the most important thing that we can tell you guys ever, this is not an 18+ panel. Don't use the F word. Don't do it. We're not going to be talking about Freud on this panel.
That's right.
We're not going to be talking about Freud.
Dealing with him.
I know a lot of people seem to think that in the psychological perspective, Freud is the initial person that you want to think of, but we're actually going to be talking about Carl Jung because a lot of his theories go a lot better with what happens in Persona. And once I guess Senpai finishes Instagramming.
I just Instagrammed all your faces. I didn't tag you though, sorry.
Alright, now the pretty pictures are going to disappear because we need to see our notes.
Goodbye.
There we go.
Alright.
That's the panel. We're done.
You got it right.
Alright, so let's talk about Carl Jung. Has anybody heard that name before?
Good.
You should have heard that name before because he's actually the reason why you take that Myers-Briggs test in school. Yeah. Okay? He came up with the idea of archetypes, shadows, the sea of the unconscious, things along those lines are all stuff he liked to talk about. He's very different from Freud. You have three major ideas still coming from him, which is like the conscious self, the unconscious self, and then the sea of the unconscious. But they're not like id, ego, and superego because it is basically like I do what I want, like my status. But your unconscious is not really the same thing. It tends to be just the stuff that you may not be aware of. So we're just going to talk a little bit about why the subconscious is important in this game. As you know, of course, the personas and the shadows represent aspects of your subconscious, and when you have them rise out of the sea of the subconscious and all this and the rest of it. It's very fascinating. And I did one just by existing, which is fantastic.
You cheated.
I cheated because of Izanami. Basically,
spoiler. Oh wait, it's not.
Wait a minute. It's not a spoiler-free panel. Okay, sorry. Okay,
Jung. Who is Jung?
Yeah. So anyway, he had a lot. Like Freud was more about psychology for patients because he was a practicing psychologist, and Jung was more like, I just like to think about it in an armchair. So he ended up. So he's got analytical psychology. He's actually called the father of analytical psychology. So the two major things to talk about is, of course, the shadow, which is the individual subconscious, which is basically all the things about yourself that you're not aware of and you maybe don't want to be aware of, and that's the reason why it's your shadow. versus the Sea of the Unconscious, which can be characterized as a wise old man in Jung's actual words.
Does that not sound familiar to anybody else? This wizened old man that brings your persona out.
Persona. Okay, guys.
So anyway, so this wise old man basically is kind of like a representation of the Sea of the Unconscious, which is kind of the collective knowledge of humanity and the collective existence of humanity. It's why everybody thinks that nooses are bad and things along those lines, because we all share this kind of like knowledge base, kind of. So personas rise out of that. The reason why personas rise out of that is because it is actually like knowing other people and learning about yourself through hanging out with other people and forming your bonds of friendship and stuff is what causes you to become gradually more and more aware of the Sea of the Unconscious, which is the collective knowledge of everybody around you, helping you become a better person. That's why you level up personas throughout the game by hanging out with other people. So anyway, that's all like, so basically the entire game is like, hi, we studied Jung and then we wanted to make a cool game about it.
Yeah. And the persona is also how, like, the face that you present to interact with people. So using the knowledge that you have through the Sea of the Unconscious and what you have for your shadow, and your knowledge as you begin to encounter your shadow, your persona changes to fit the knowledge that you're continuing to grow, so you interact with people in a way that's more acceptable, is another thing. So that's why also the personas grow as you continue to talk to people.
And Soji's the best at changing his personas, and he's the only person who can because he's the most connected to the Sea of Unconscious.
Yeah. What about Minato, Persona 3?
We'll talk about.
We're not talking about
Free
it.
is not part of this panel, unfortunately.
Yeah. The second thing I wanted to, just last two things I wanted to mention really quickly. Individuation, which we're going to talk a lot about more later, is basically what the characters go through, kind of, when they're like, wow, I'm really terrible in this one aspect. Oh no, it's my shadow's taking over me. Okay, then I got a persona because I've acknowledged that that's a part of me. And that's basically just gradually getting to know your shadow until you finally reach the point where you don't really have one, or as little as one as possible, because you become enlightened about yourself through understanding other people as well. And lastly, archetypes, of course, are really important to him. That's why he admires Briggs test. Everybody fits into set types of personalities, which also feeds into tarot.
Yeah, the archetypes are part of the Sea of the Unconscious. It's basically like roles in society that everyone is part of. In the Sea of the Unconscious, everyone has innate knowledge of. So like there's like a mother archetype, a father archetype, other things like roles that are in society that people just like know. And she mentioned tarot, and that's the next section we're actually going to talk about, because a lot of Jungian psychology ties very closely into tarot. Tarot was not actually used as a metaphysical divination tool. It's actually been more popularly used as a tool of self-reflection. And there's a lot less that's mystic to do with it, so much as using these cards to reflect on yourself and get a better sense of yourself, and to try and give yourself new perspective to your situations. Jung and a lot of those themes tie very closely into Jungian psychology with the shadow, etc., etc., etc. For the tarot, you obviously have the major arcana, which is mostly what we're going to be talking about. There's also the minor arcana, which all of the minor arcana cards have a bunch of symbolism that's associated with them as well, but since they're not brought up at all in Persona 4, it's really irrelevant.
They didn't have enough time to develop.
They didn't have time to get through all of the cards. But all of the major arcana cards also reflect archetypes. Each of them has a theme. Each of them has something that they represent and are connected to things like that. The major arcana is actually tied to something called the Journey of the Fool. You have the 22 major arcana. There's 21 major arcana cards. The first one is the Fool, which is numbered 0. It is also the 22nd card. So it's a full circle of, you have the Fool going on this journey, and each thing that he encounters along the way is represented by a card of the major arcana, which is why in the game you have your social links that are represented by the major arcana cards. So every person that you encounter that you have a social link bond with is represented by these cards.
And obviously, protagonist is the Fool.
And protagonist is the Fool.
when it comes to the protagonist, like the thing is basically like this is literally the journey of discovery of self, basically, and that's what tarot is all about. So that's why the journey of the Fool is extremely important.
Yeah.
So
It's the Fool going through things, learning different things as he encounters different things in his life. So, and then when he reaches the end, coming to the realization of a lot of different things. But then it's also like the journey starts over because the Fool is the first card and the last card. So it's something that continues to go on, which is something that is also reflected by continuing to acknowledge parts of your shadow and develop yourself.
New game plus.
It all ties together in a really neat little package, doesn't it, guys? So in terms of talking about the characters with their specific arcana, there is a lot to be said about the themes tied to each major arcana card and how that is shown in the characters that are represented by them. I'm not going to have time to talk about all of them, but I would like to talk about a few specifically, just so you guys can get an idea that no, they didn't just slap random cards on random characters. This was actually really, really well thought out.
Why does Yosuke fight with daggers, yet he's the magician?
Well, well, funny you should say that, because Yosuke is actually the first one I'm going to talk about. Yosuke is represented by the Magician card. The Magician is a catalyst card. It's a starting card. It's bringing elements together, initiation, manipulation, not so much in like negative manipulation, but able to use your influence to make things happen. And considering that Yosuke is the one who starts the investigation by getting you to go back into the TV and investigate what happened to Saki. He's your mouthpiece through the entire game, and there's a lot of connection to the Magician card in terms of communication and bringing things together. And he's the one, because protagonist doesn't talk a whole hell of a lot during the game. Yosuke
calm down.
Yosuke is the one who's doing a lot of the talking and would probably say the things that you would say if they were able to give the protagonist actual lines, but you don't. So those themes all tie really well into Yosuke as the magician. Is this that's all I'm also talking about? Also, okay. Also, this doesn't necessarily apply to every card, but looking at some of the reverse traits of the magician. When an arcana card shows up reversed, this has to do with how you're reading the cards, it's usually like the more negative side of the same traits. So for the magician, that would mean using your influence for selfish gains, broken communication, sort of like more of like a selfish motivation for what the card represents. And that's also really reflected really well in Yosuke's insecurities and his shadow. So it's, initially I didn't really think that Yosuke fit the magician very well, but the more that I started looking into it, the more I was really surprised by how deep all of the connections were with him. So it's actually like one of my favorites to talk about. Using your influence to try and manipulate things to your advantage. With Yosuke, that meant like what his shadow brought up about an adventure and pursuing the investigation as a means of entertainment for himself.
He manipulates the protagonist in going back in on the pretense of investigating this murder, but really he's like, wow, this place is cool, so.
Yeah. Which sounds a lot like a certain person who started shoving people in TVs because he claimed it was for the fun of it. And I think we're gonna take a little bit of a deviation right now because someone wants to talk about this.
Really, really short detour. Yosuke's my favorite character. Yeah.
Raise your hand if you love Yosuke.
Yay!
Good.
We like you.
About half of you. The other half, how many of you hate Yosuke?
You're allowed.
Yeah, I saw
Okay.
that. I thought that would happen.
Fair
Okay.
enough.
No, Yosuke's kind of a jerk. It's true, but he's a teenage boy, so I forgive him. Okay, quickly though, basically, Yosuke is really interesting because again, he's your mouthpiece throughout the game, and that's part of the reason why it's such a big deal when you have to. When it's like, let's throw Namatame into the television, and you have to stop him. Like literally, the entire conversation is just like, stop, calm down, let's think about this.
Yeah.
Stop.
We'll talk about that a little later on too.
But the reason why it's so important is because you're kind of taking Yosuke's journey in a way because he has to talk for you, because that way you can say things like calm down and that's it. And the second, but as a result, it's really important that he has a lot of parallels to Adachi. he has the same interest in the terms of his shadow. Adachi's all like, oh, I just do this to be interested. It's because it's interesting to me. Yosuke's shadow has almost an identical line at the beginning. He literally says, I thought this would be really fun and interesting to do. That's why I wanted to come back to the TV world. They have this whole, they're all also Lost City boys, like they got sent out to the country against their will. They don't want to be there. And both of them kind of react the same way. Yosuke's kind of just sullen and kind of manipulative because he doesn't really, he wants to be popular and liked, but nobody likes him. He's kind of like,
In terms of like, and the quote that Yosuke Shadow actually does when you actually start his battle is, I'll crush everything that bores me, starting with you. And it sounds a lot like Adachi trying to look for something to entertain himself.
If you want to really creep yourself out, just think about the fact that someday, if Yosuke had not met protagonist, there's a chance he would have been Adachi. And that's really terrifying. So anyway, that's why Yosuke is so great, because he doesn't become that person, and that's why I love him. So anyway, back to Yukiko Tarot.
Other major arcana. Yeah, I'm going to talk about Yukiko very briefly, and I'll try and briefly touch on a few others because I think we need to move on to some other points. Yukiko is the High Priestess. The High Priestess is connection to your personal journey, finding out more about yourself, your spiritual side, and like internal reflection. And with Yukiko's social link, it's all about her finding her own path and trying to find out what she wants from life and how she realizes what she wants. So that's also really well reflected from the High Priestess. It also kind of parallels with Kanji as the Emperor, because the Emperor is all about masculinity, what's expected from like a masculine perspective in society and like all those things. And Kanji really struggles with that also. By like being like, well, I like to sew and do girly things, and his journey is all about coming to terms with that. That's not necessarily how he needs to be. So those two like kind of tie together. Another one I want to talk about, because I don't really have time to do all of them, as I said. I want to do a few of the investigation team. I also want to do a couple of the extraneous social links. So I'm going to talk about the Hanged Man Arcana a little bit. How many of you guys have played Hanged Man Arcana?
That's more than I was expecting.
Yeah. How many of you guys have not played Hanged Man Arcana?
That's okay.
Okay. The Hanged Man Arcana is Naoki Konishi. He's Saki's brother. And I would really, really encourage you guys, if you go to play through the game again, try and start that social link, because personally it's one of my favorites. The Hanged Man Arcana is one of my favorite cards. And it is all about being stuck. It's about not being able to move forward, not being able to move back, being kind of in a state of complacency and trappedness. And this is really, really well represented by Naoki's state when you first encounter him. A lot of people, his teachers are letting him slack off in school because they don't want him to pressure himself. His sisters died, and pretty much everyone in town treats him the same way, that they don't have any expectations of him. He has no responsibilities, but as a result, he has no motivation in life, and so he can just basically do whatever he wants. And for him, he feels like that's not okay. And so as the link goes on, it's him coming to terms with his sister's death and finally being able to accept it and feel sadness from it, because he hasn't been able to do that yet. And when you finally max out the social link, it's him being able to cry over his sister's death, and through that, working through his grief so he can move on and become a better person. It's a really fantastic representation of the Hanged Man Arcana, and I really want you guys to play it if you haven't. We are going to jump a little bit, even though I have some other ones. So if you guys want me to talk more about Arcana cards, we can get to that a little later. The last one I want to talk about is the Judgment Arcana. And that is the Arcana that the investigation team gets post the encounter with Namatame. The Judgment Arcana brings to mind like final judgment, because it has like an angel with trumpets on the card, but it's also about discernment. It's about taking the information that you have, weighing your options, and trying to figure out which way to go is the correct one. So it's kind of the like two different kinds of judgment in that sense. And the entire tone of the game changes after you get through Namatame's arc. You thought it was about finding a murderer, and all of a sudden everything that you thought was going on in the game is totally wrong.
How many of you thought you got the true end after Namatame?
Okay. No one was happy with the Namatame.
All right, good.
But from that point on, it's about reaching out to what's really going on and finding out everything that's going on behind the scenes. And so it's using that, like remembering everything that's gone on, even like the most insignificant detail, which the Judgment Arcana does continue through the true ending. You don't max it unless you get the true ending, if I'm remembering correctly. And so it's literally remembering every single detail that you went through the game, back to the first thing that happened when the gas station attendant shook your hand, and using that to find the truth. And that's what the Judgment Arcana is all about.
How many of you saw that long list of names and freaked out at the very end?
I was going 100%.
All right.
Nanako did it, definitely.
It was definitely Nanako.
And so you don't get to reach the true ending unless you're completely aware of what's going on. And so that's something that's...
So what I'm going to talk about is we're going to take a little departure from psychology into the mythology portion. I get to be vaguely important. All right, what I'm basically going to go over real quickly is all throughout this game you have a lot of names thrown around. So two of the main important names that you don't even realize from the start is Izanami and Izanagi. Who had heard about these names before this game? I'm really proud of you. Who knows the story of Izanami and Izanagi? I like all of you. All right, we're gonna do a brief refresher of that story in a moment, but first I want to go over with you guys a few basics of Shintoism because they play a lot into the themes of the game as you're playing through it. And as a Japanese consumer of the game, which this game was for, I know we like the games, but they're made in Japan, they're made for a Japanese audience by Japanese creators. There's a few implications that we might not pick up because we haven't grown up there and we're not used to it. So basically in Shintoism, we have a few key concepts that you're going to find abruptly familiar. One is the idea of pollution. When death happens or something bad happens, it's not just something that happens once and then goes away. Spiritually, the entire area is polluted by what just happened. Something like one of the worst things that could possibly happen is that something die at a shrine. Shrines are very important gateways between where we live and the spiritual world, which kind of exists side by side in the Shintoism, the way they think about it. But the shrine is the gateway between those two places, and then something dies there and everything's terrible forever. And if this doesn't make you think a little bit of how, this fog kind of shows up sort of like a pollution fog, that gray, green, polluting fog that was kind of creepy. And everything starts with someone dying. Suddenly someone dies and everything is terrible. And then and then suddenly other people die. And more people die. And then you find weird, crazy zombie people around. And it gets really creepy really fast. This ties right back into all those concepts of pollution with death in particular. And it's spreading throughout the fog. So if you see, like as a Japanese person approaching the game, you look at that and you're like, okay. Shintoism. One of the other things, I just mentioned the shrine. There is the shrine in the game. Who played did all the foxes stuff? All right, the fox is a little bit more important thematically than you might have expected. It's not just a side quest that gives you kind of cool things at the end. One of the other things that's going on right now culturally in Japan is there's this concept of the country versus the city. And we're going into the country, and they talk a lot about how, oh God, we're in the country, this sucks. But what's happening socially right now is this is a huge issue. The small country towns are losing entire populations. The average age of a lot of the small towns right now are about 30 to 40 years old. Which is kind of, bad. And a lot of the kids are leaving the country just like Yosuke wants to do and wants to go to the city where everything's cool. But they're leaving behind. There's also this ingrained concept that the country is where you go back home. Your family's from the country. You identify with your family there. On Oban, the Day of the Dead, you go back home to the country. You go back home for your traditions. That's where it's considered, that's where the Shinto, your local Shinto shrine still lives. And then we go back to Inaba with its shrine, and the shrine's broken up and down, and the fox is desperately trying to build it back up again. And yet the shrine is also the gateway between us and the gods. It's the place where we go there and we talk to them, and they talk to us. And they kind of understand our needs and wants, and we try to understand what they want. And we go back and forth. But the shrine in Inaba is not being used. It's being left behind. The fox is desperate. He's asking this random kid who walks up, oh, by the way, could you do stuff for me?
Actually, speaking of that, this is actually what the Hermit Arcana is all about. It's isolation in the sense of reconnecting to your spiritual self, which ties really well into what the Fox is all about, and all of these themes about Shintoism.
So when you go into the game and you are familiar with Shintoism and the Japanese culture, and you see that the Shinto shrine's broken down, and suddenly the gods are doing weird crap. Maybe this is connected. It's a signpost for you saying this is giving you the hint early on that maybe it's more than just this random TV business. Maybe the gods are involved, such as Izanami.
Did anybody try to go to the shrine before the day that you can start the Fox Arcana? It actually says in the dialogue, it's like, oh, it's a dilapidated old shrine. Okay, because the reason it's basically kind of like screaming, something is wrong spiritually here, and you just don't know because we're not really from that kind of culture, you know. So
the other thing I really want to impress upon you is that kami, like Izanagi, Izanami, they're kami. We call them gods, but within Shintoistic within that context, good and evil isn't really a thing. You don't have good gods and bad gods, and then they battle it out, and like at the end they have tea, and they're still the same size as they were before. They're mutable. We can't really understand them. They can change their minds. So Izanami and Izanagi themselves as figures, they're not a good and a bad. They're more mutable than that. So when you approach the game and you see how the many forms that Izanagi takes, this is perfectly acceptable within the concept of Shintoism from which they come, because there isn't good and evil, and there's also a tradition of gods sort of putting themselves out into the world and possessing people a little bit, and having travels, or having a bird or an animal represent them and come to take a look at us, see what we're doing, and meddle a little bit, especially Izanami.
Can I touch your hand?
So coming up to Izanami and Izanagi, I was going to talk about a few of the gods you see, like Amaterasu and Susanoo, and their stories, but we don't have a lot of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my two co-presenters stand up, and we're going to recreate for you the story of Izanami and Izanagi for all of you who are not familiar with it. Izanami and Izanagi are the creation gods in Shintoistic myth. They're the first two that come down and make everything start happening. And this is going to give you a great concept of the relationship between the protagonist and his antagonist, and also why Izanagi and Izanami are so important to what's going on in the game and why they don't like each other. So when they first came down from the heavens, they were like, hey, we should get married, but we have to go around this pillar. Going around this pillar, and so we have to do this properly. We're going around this pillar, and then suddenly they met.
Yo, you're hot. Let's get married.
In this, right now, Kanji is playing Izanami the lead. But they went around this pillar and they talked to each other like, yeah, let's do it. And she talked first, and then they had a baby. Baby! But it was kind of not right.
It's like a pile of sludge.
it's made out of tar. Maybe you should.
Literally, it's described as being like a sludge-like strange creature, and they realized they might have done it wrong.
Maybe you shouldn't have talked first. Only guys should talk first. Let's try this again.
So they go back around the pillar again and act as if they don't even know each other. And then when they meet each other again, this time, it works, and they give birth to a bunch of gods, including Amaterasu and Susanoo, some of the names that you've heard in the game, and everything's great for a while. And then they keep having babies, and they keep having babies, and more kami are made, and they keep having babies. It's kind of a long story. Until they give birth to a fire god that kind of doesn't, just imagine it. You gave birth to a fire god.
Does that ever end well for gods?
No. So what happens is Izanami dies, and Izanagi's like, my wife's dead. This is terrible. Why don't I wait around a little bit before I do something about it? Izanami is dead. She's in the land of the dead, and she's left there for a long time because Izanagi isn't on top of anything, apparently. And she's waiting for him in the darkness, and he goes, maybe I should go look for her. So he goes into the darkness, he's looking for her, and she's been waiting for him, and he never came. So in the meanwhile, she's eaten of the funeral goods of the underworld. It's sort of a Persephone story all over again, only she's a little bit more pissed off. And when he finally finds her, she's covered in shadow, and this is going to start sounding a little bit familiar from her final boss form. She's covered in shadow. We're not quite sure what she looks like. Izanagi's like, yo, wife, let's leave. And she's like, buddy, you were supposed to be here about 5 hours ago, and I was hungry. So I'm kind of mad. He's like, but wait. I need to take this this light, which is often used as a symbol for truth, which is a big theme in the game. And he goes to Izanami, who's our big antagonist, who's been hiding behind all these faces throughout the game. We keep meeting her. We don't know we're meeting her. And she gets lit up by his light, and he looks at her, and she's like, ah! Because in the meanwhile, she turns like into this big rock. She basically looks like a corpse.
You died. Why? Wait. Oh, you were in the underworld all this time?
Yeah.
Oh, I guess that's why you're rotted and disgusting. Ew, I'm leaving. Bye.
So he freaks out. She's like, they haven't seen each other for years, and she's been down in the dead world, and he's like, I'm out. Sorry, I'm out. She is pissed again.
You're not pretty anymore, bye.
So he goes running out. She's sending all of her minions after him. All of her minions are running after Izanagi.
To try to
drag him back to her. He finally runs out. He's like, how do I close this door? How do I make sure I'm safe? He rolls a boulder over it. And Izanami goes to the boulder and like, damn, there's a boulder. And once she finds the boulder, this magical boulder. And then she looks at it, she's like, all right, I can't do anything to you, so I'm gonna do something to the most precious things you have, the humans. I'm gonna mess with your humans. I'm gonna make 1,000 of your humans die every single day. And he's like, well, okay, that's a problem. But I believe in humanity. I like humans. So you know what? I'm just gonna make more of them. I'm gonna make 1,500 of them every day. This is a pretty typical, like, very stacked. But if you think about it, just look at that situation where he has to run after her. She's pissed off at him. She kind of wants him back, but she doesn't. But he's the only one who can deal with her. And humans are his special people. And then Izanami goes and messes with them. So all of this is in the background of the game as we're playing it, and while Jungian psychology is playing out for the rest of us.
So now we're going to talk about how all of those things come together in what we find out in the final hours of the game. So this is going to be a section that I like to call Izanami and the New World Fools. Sounds like a 60s band, doesn't it?
Yeah. The important thing to hear is, and I'm going to just talk briefly about this, because the shrine is how the gods communicate, right? So basically, Izanami's been just sitting here being like she's in this town, okay, because she's in like all the Persona games, all right? And she's like, man, I don't understand what people want, and they're not taking care of the shrine, so I can't talk to them there. Where can I talk to them? And she chooses.
How do I talk to these people? They cut the phone lines.
I don't understand this anymore. So she does two things. Okay, one, she talks to people through the television. If you look at the setup in a hotel room, where's the TV? It's like front and center.
Where are all the hotel TVs in your hotel rooms? Right in front of the bed.
Right. It's basically.
We're good. I think we're good.
Okay. And it's basically just the whole point of that is that it's like that's kind of where we worship these days. It's a kind of a place of worship. It's where we go and we escape from everything too. So she's like, go ahead.
Well, like now you might also compare it to the internet, because how much time do we all spend in front of our computers? A lot.
Back at the time, but television came process. Anyway.
Considering a lot of the themes in Persona were supposed to be slightly retro, it makes a lot of sense why they would choose a TV aside from a computer.
So in any case, that's how she wants to communicate with everybody, and then the other thing she does is, of course, pick 3 representatives.
Mm-hmm. Also, another thing about the TV, and the only other thing you do with the TV throughout the game besides check the weather, is watch Tanaka's Amazing Commodities. So it ties into like this very materialistic and sort of self-centered, earth-focused societal tone and way of living that people have begun to adopt, and the deviation of that from the spiritual and the higher things.
Meanwhile, we're also all staring at this TV to watch people doing really weird things on the Midnight Channel. Like.
How many people like reality television? I like
That's
you guys.
Okay, you're allowed.
I'm excited for Survivor and Amazing Things.
You're honest, bless your face.
But it's this visceral enjoyment of other people's suffering that's going on. And doesn't that remind you of death and Izanami being really upset?
Because people are losing their connections. People are losing their bonds because they're so focused on not interacting with people.
Okay.
But in that sense, we're going to talk now about the representatives that Izanami chooses to try and connect back to humanity. And she chooses 3 representatives with each of them representing a different aspect So
And there's a lot of controversy about these aspects.
A lot of controversy. We're going to talk about that. These aspects, as you guys probably all know, are hope, emptiness, and despair. And the first one we're going to talk about is emptiness.
Yep. Okay, so basically, first thing, 3 representatives, they're blank slates to her. They come from outside of the city. She doesn't actually know anything about them. They just show up and she's like, you'll do, shakes their hand, creeps them out. Suddenly they've got the personas.
But they're not people who are connected to the town. They've all come from outside into the town. They're a new start, a fresh beginning to see what's going to happen with whatever she's planning.
Exactly. So this is her quote about the 3 heroes that she chooses. One had not the eyes to see things as they were and failed to awaken his power. One chose to avert his eyes from the truth and allowed evil to taint his awakened power. This one, he has come far, yet he still yearns for the truth.
Yes!
So anyway, you might have lost it.
We can keep going.
Okay,
got it.
So anyway, first one we're going to talk about is actually going to be emptiness.
We're going to get to that.
Yeah.
We're going to get to that right now.
So so basically we have the 3 concepts: hope, despair, and emptiness. And so briefly, the Japanese.
So it's really important to know the actual Japanese words these are being translated from, because it helps clarify a little bit what they're meaning. Because especially with the emptiness term used, it's really hard to get the nuances across when you have, like, you've been translating for 90 hours this freaking game. So basically the 3 words they actually use in the game is kibo, which is hope. This might sound vaguely familiar. These are going to be terms that you've heard in anime before. Kibo is hope. Hyomu is emptiness. Zetsubo is despair. Now, Zetsubo and Kibo are interesting because they're almost exactly the same word in Japanese. If you're not familiar, there are kanji compound. There's one kanji, another kanji, and together they make the word. They both share the second kanji, the bo, Zetsubo, Kibo. The bo is the same. Both of these bo's mean hope. Kibo is sort of like double hope. Hope twice. Zetsubo is the removal or the lack of hope. So these two, even just looking at the way they're written, are set up as opposites. Kibo, Zetsubo. They're 2 ends of a spectrum, having it and not having it, and they're directly related to each other. Kyomu's different. Kyomu means more, and if a more nuanced translation that we have 5 minutes now to give you, it means not so much emptiness, but a nihilistic worldview. It's a lack of something, which within the context that we're talking about doesn't mean despairing or anything like that. It just means it's that an empty space is still a thing. It's an absence, but it's still something. It's not a loss, it's not a gain, it's just there. But it's important. Negative space is important.
When Igor is talking about the Fool Arcana, because all of Izanami's representatives are also represented by the Fool Arcana, he says that it's like the number 0, empty yet containing infinite potential within itself. And that's very much connected to this idea of emptiness, where it can be something, it can be basically anything, or it can just be nothing at all, which is basically what the concept of emptiness is.
And most people, when they decide who is who in the game, Adachi, protagonist, and Namatame, they assign them a certain way.
And now we're going to talk about that a little bit, okay? Who do you think is emptiness? Let's get...
Wait, all right, let's do a voting so we don't have yelling at us.
Who thinks Adachi is emptiness?
Go ahead, guys.
It's okay.
Honestly,
it's
what do you
okay.
think? Who thinks Adachi's emptiness? Who thinks Namatame's emptiness? You are all brilliant.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
And obviously the protagonist, most everyone agrees, is Hope.
Mm-hmm.
But there's argument about Adachi and Namatame.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about Namatame first. I think Namatame is emptiness, okay? And the reason why is because Namatame does not change. We talked a little bit about nihilistic point of view. It's basically kind of like there is no purpose to life, okay? From dust we came, to dust we will return. There's absolutely nothing important about our existence. That's not necessarily bad. It's just kind of like, so you live your life the way you're going to live your life. So
you accept the fact you're going to turn to dust, and you're okay with it.
Exactly.
You're okay with it.
So nihilism isn't really negative. It is to us maybe, but it's not actually a negative concept. It's a neutral concept. And Namatame never changes. He starts out as a councilman. He quits being a councilman, becomes a delivery man who throws people in televisions, stops being that, and goes back to being and then if you play Golden, you find out that he's going back to try and be a councilman. So literally his entire arc is like here, down, and back up, and nothing changes. He's on a pendulum. It doesn't do anything, really. He doesn't actually make a journey. He's just traversed the same path, not even changed at all. At no point does he accept the fact that there is anything beyond what is directly in front of him. He's like, there's a television. I like escaping by watching television. It must be a safe place to be inside the
Now
television.
let's throw people in it.
That's where I put that. It's so smart. So anyway, he's just, so he doesn't.
But he never asks why this is happening.
Exactly.
Why is my television suddenly a gateway to this strange shadow place? I don't care. I'm just gonna throw people in it.
He never questions anything, and he never asks the question why things are happening. He just accepts things as they are, which ties back to the whole nihilistic view of things.
And it ties back to the idea of, did he accept a shadow? Did he reject a shadow? He did neither, which is why he doesn't actually awaken a persona at all.
That big demon baby, I was very scarred.
Yeah, that thing was creepy. So, so that song is Your World's Full. Great name. And essentially by having that be the thing that he's not actually has anything to do with Izanagi, whereas Adachi, on the other hand, does have an Izanagi.
Yeah.
Adachi's a special guy.
Now we're going to talk about despair. Adachi is despair. Remember how you guys... Okay, remember how I told you guys that you were going to know who my favorite character was by the end of this panel? Because my favorite character is Adachi. So despair, like Lindsay was saying, it's hopelessness. It's the lack of having hope in your life. For Adachi, when he starts his journey, when we first encounter him at the end of the game, even though we don't know this about him, he has literally come from a downslide. He's come from being demoted. He got banished to the country, and he's basically come as low as he can go. And from his perspective, it's the world that's put him there. He has this this expectation that the world was supposed to give him everything. If you listen to some of the stuff he says later in the game, he's very angry, he's very bitter. He had this expectation that he was going to be something great, and that has not happened for him. In fact, whatever he did has put him...
All he gets is dojo.
He lost. He lost everything. But what he doesn't do is accept the fact that he's the person who's put himself in that position. He doesn't accept that he's done anything negative, that he's done anything wrong. He chooses to turn around and blame everybody else for his problems, which kind of results in this really interesting parallel with what we were talking about with Jungian psychology. Remember how we were talking about the persona and the shadow and accepting your shadow, etc., and how that plays in the game? With Adachi, he is a wonderful example of how that actually works in a psychological context. Because at the beginning of his arc, Adachi is completely rejecting any fault that he has in what's going on in his life. We're talking about...
Well, in particular, like
Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Because he's rejected everything that is coming at him, like he basically kind of is like, dude, none of this is my fault.
It's not my fault.
Yeah, so therefore...
And you're all like me, so I'm not any different.
Oh, sorry. I've got it, okay. So, his life is going... He's like, oh, well, I think this girl is really hot. I'm gonna go try and, like, totally bang her. And then she doesn't want to have sex with him because he's kind of a creep, but he doesn't think he's a creep. And so he ends up accidentally shoving her into the television Well, the intention was not to throw her in the TV. The intention was to rape her. Trigger warning.
But he was going to do something really bad, but then he just threw her into a television and she died anyway.
Yeah. So then he threw her in the TV. And he's like, wow, that sure did just happen. And then just kind of walks away. One of my favorite Adachi character moments is when you're first introduced to his characters, when you find Mayumi's body, and the first thing you get of Adachi is him running off the screen to go vomit in the grass. And that's the moment that he is inextricably confronted with what he's done. And
that's his shadow.
And that's his shadow has suddenly shown up and it's a dead girl.
Yeah. And what does he do? He vomits. He rejects it. And that continues to play out through the entire rest of the game. Everything that you see him doing is him continuing to reject his persona. I actually screen capped some stuff from the Wikipedia page about shadows and
part of what's happening with Adachi too is instead of accepting a shadow and really confronting it and running away instead, and it still kind of chases
it kind
him
of starts
anyway,
to eat him.
It means that it's when you confront your shadow and everything goes horribly wrong.
What happens in Jung's words when you start to reject your shadow is that if you don't accept it, it starts to take you over. And so that's a really negative thing to happen with someone's psychological state. What the wiki says is shadow. Okay, here we go.
If you can
I actually think I missed
imagine
the
being
screen
taken
cap
over
that I
by
wanted.
all the negative aspects of your personality,
I think I missed the
sucks.
I think I missed the screen cap that I wanted, but what basically starts to happen is that the shadow starts to overtake your personality, and that results in things like melancholia and being like you not acting necessarily in a way that you would because your mental state is so agitated.
A lot of things similar to what you see in depression and clinical depression diagnoses.
Yeah, sort of on the side. So when we finally encounter Adachi and it's revealed that he is the killer, kind of apparent that he's not really in an okay state of mind. He's
There's
a little
something
nuts
wrong.
by that point. He's a little nuts, and that's what, because in a psychological context, his shadow has taken him over because he has rejected it so hard. Izanami says that he refuses to face the truth, and that's why you end up with him in this state. I'm going to finish up by talking about how that's reflected in Magatsu Izanagi, because Magatsu Izanagi is really corrupted. The reason he's corrupted is because Adachi hasn't accepted his persona, and so summoning his persona is a forced thing that happens. When he summons
And
his
also,
persona...
Izanagi's whole point is revealing the truth and bringing the light of truth to you.
Yeah.
And Adachi's not doing that, so he gets the reversed dark version of it.
Yeah, he gets the Izanagi that was corrupted when he came out of Yomi, and when he summons Izanagi, he doesn't do it by like using the Arcana card. He literally clutches his head and screams in pain because it's a corrupt thing that he's not really supposed to have access to at that point, but he can because Izanagi gave it to him.
And that's all the time we have for the panel. Thank you guys so much for sitting and listening to us.
I really wish we had time to like get comments when we talked, but you can see we were running to finish the panel. If you would like to talk to any of us or to argue with us, discuss something, we will be outside in the hallway for the next probably half hour. Talk to you about it. We'll be around. So
Can't get my mind out of those memories. Now time to tell them don't take my dream. Still